Okay, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the material that's covered in a book that I published in 2007 that grew out of the work that I did for my master's degree and my thesis under Nick Campion at Vassar University in the UK, where we covered a lot of stellar religion. And I was very inspired by a lot of what I learned there. Turned it into a book right away. Now, this is actually on the web in large part, and I will be referring to the website. I'm gonna go to that right now. Okay. There we go. Yeah, this is my site, and it's called the Star of Magi.com. So if anybody wants to go there on their computer now and follow along, I'm going to go back and forth between these pages. Quite a few of the chapters are on there, as well as a lot of material from my thesis. There's 2 different sets of bibliographies. There's a lot of endnotes, so it's a good source. And as I said, I'm going to be referring back and forth to that with the PowerPoint today. So if you want to go to www.thestarofthemagi.com, you'll find all of this right there, and as I said, you can follow along and use it for future reference. This is actually from the introduction and the prologue, and I actually want to start with reading from it because, you know, the great thing about publishing, I find, is I spend a lot of time crafting my writing and trying to make it say exactly what I want to say, and then it's published, then it's done. I don't have to keep reformulating it. I really enjoy that. So that's why I'm going back to it now. The Star of the Magi remains one of the most popular and puzzling mysteries of the Bible, and its inclusion at the very beginning of the very first gospel raises any number of good questions. I mean, why would the authors and the editors of the Christian Gospels choose Zoroastrian Magi and astrology to herald the coming of Jesus Christ? I mean, that's a really good question. How did that ever make the canonical cut? You know, it's pretty heterodox. Did the Magi have some special significance then that we have since lost? After all, the New Testament narrative opens with them. So who were they? And did their astrological beliefs really lead them to Jesus? Once we understand who the Magi were, how their astrology informed their beliefs, and how much those beliefs influenced their Jewish neighbors, some strikingly obvious conclusions emerge. And those are the 3 questions that I'm going to focus on today. Again, I'm not asking what was the Star of the Magi. I'm asking different questions, and I think we get some better answers that way. And this book in particular highlights the Magi's surprisingly widespread influence, shedding new light on the rise of both monotheism and messianic expectations throughout the Middle East and throughout the Christian West as well. Now, obviously, many other solutions to this mystery have been proposed, and every year there are new ones. And in particular, when I wrote this book about 11, 12 years ago, modern astronomers were very keen on the star. And the last several decades have seen the appearance of a heavenly host of books and papers and planetarium shows proposing just about everything from comets, supernovas, chance sightings of Uranus, any number of planetary conjunctions, eclipses, and occultations. Now, their methods usually involved examining a list of likely astronomical events to see if anything fit the meager descriptions in the Gospel of Matthew. And once a particular event had been chosen, then creative explanations needed to be offered as to why it must have been meaningful to the Jews. That's the astronomical approach. And in fact, that's the astrological approach, because astrologers do the same thing. And every year there's new astrological books and papers, and this is the Star of Bethlehem. No, this is my Star of Bethlehem. And, you know, it kind of turns into a contest, and everybody wants their star to win. But, you know, no real consensus has ever arisen from this line of inquiry. And it just gets very competitive. There's just too many phenomena to choose from. And it's too easy to back engineer religious rationalization from any of them. And without a solid background in astrology and religious studies and history, that's what those researchers must do, is engineer religious rationalizations. And unfortunately, you know, being a great astronomer or astrophysicist does not really qualify you to do ancient history. And similarly, being able to read a chart does not qualify you to do even history of astrology or history of religion. You know, they're different disciplines. And again, that's why you've got so many competing papers, and it has gotten really competitive. Now, when I wrote the book, the hot astronomical theory at the time was by the astronomer Michael Molnar. He'd received a lot of attention, and rightly so, for a 1999 book called The Star of Bethlehem, The Legacy of the Magi. And Molnar concluded that it was an occultation of Jupiter by the moon in the sign of Aries. And this was his most likely candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. And he even had a chart. He's an astronomer, but he had a birth chart for the date of April 17th, 6 BCE, for the birth of Jesus Christ. And he even had, you know, the horoscope for Jesus. He had the sun, moon, Jupiter, and Saturn all in the fiery, aggressive sign of Aries, like the Lamb of God as the Ram of God. And in arriving at his conclusion, Molnar was one of the first astronomers to attempt to factor in the principles of ancient astrology. In fact, Professor Bradley Schaefer from Louisiana State said in a review of Molnar's work from Sky and Telescope, he said, "The old astronomical views are guaranteed to be irrelevant. The new astrological paradigm forces the realization that astrology was an important force in historical times, so that the disregard of the topic by most historians is blatant chauvinism." Well, yay! You know, that's an important realization, a very important realization. So, you know, we gained a little bit of ground there. Now, I certainly applaud Molnar for moving in the right direction and trying to grasp the astrology of the star as it was perceived in its day. That's important. Unfortunately, Molnar was not very particular about which ancient astrology he used. His research, like much of Western scholarship, is firmly entrenched in the classical and Hellenistic camp. This is a big bias. And it's a problem in a lot of the history and the way we approach history in the West. For instance, Molnar draws his astrological references from the work of Western astrologers like Claudius Ptolemy, who was a 2nd century Alexandrian, and particularly Firmicus Maternus. He used him a lot, who practiced in Rome in the 4th century CE after Christ. Meanwhile, the Gospel of Matthew makes it clear that the astrologers in question were Magi. They were Persians, not Romans, not 2nd century Alexandrians. And the Persian Magi were great astrologers. Of that, there's no doubt. But to assume that Persian Magi in the 1st century BC were practicing the same kind of Hellenistic astrology as Ptolemy or Firmicus Maternus, that's a big leap in the wrong direction, in my opinion. The Persians had their own distinct school of astrology. A fact that's been largely ignored, not only in Molnar's work, but throughout most of the research on the star. And that, again, is entirely in keeping with our Western classical worldview. We rarely acknowledge the far-reaching scientific and religious contributions of the Persians. They're the traditional enemies of our cultural heroes, the Greeks and Romans. We're very biased, and we maintain that bias throughout Western culture to this day. Once you start to think about it, you're going to see that it's still very much with us. On the other hand, Judeans living at the time of Christ were very much aware of the contributions of their Persian neighbors. Greece and Rome had not been kind to the Jews, whereas the nearby Parthian Persians and their Magi had long been their friends and allies against these brutal foreign invaders. And I quote here Norman Cohn, who wrote a wonderful book called Cosmos, Chaos, and the World to Come. I highly recommend him. He says, for 2 centuries, Judea formed part of the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire. And Achaemenid rule was relatively benign and was recognized by the Jews to be so, whereas there's plenty of Jewish propaganda against Babylonian and Seleucid, Hellenistic, and Roman rule. There's not a single Jewish text, biblical or rabbinic, directed against Persian rule. And that's a very important point, because they loved the Persians, and the Persians had their back and saved them every time. How quickly we forget. The Islamic scholar Syed Amir Ajoman drives the point home in his article, Messianism, Millennialism, and Revolution, in describing the early days of Jewish Messianism. He says Persian notions spread widely in the Hellenistic era and gave rise to a particular oracular form of resistance to Hellenistic domination that was absorbed into intertestamental apocalypticism. Now, that's a lot of big words, but what he's saying is that the Judeans were inspired in their endless uprisings against their Greek and Roman overlords by the Persian religion and its astrology. Further, in direct contrast to the Hellenistic and classical astrology described in Molner's work, Persian astrology was replete with apocalyptic prophecies and messianic promises. Their astrology thoroughly permeated their religion, and vice versa. That's the astrology of the Magi. And again, those are the kind of questions that I want to ask and what I want to actually look at in this presentation. Now, before I say another word about the Star of Bethlehem, the Star of the Magi, I want to draw your attention to a wonderful paper that was published back in 1993 by a fellow named Kim Hoffenloff, who's had an interesting career. And in this, he calls it the Star of Bethlehem casts light on its modern interpreters. And again, in keeping with the whole idea of history versus historiography, and putting our biases out on the table so we can, look at them and really try to break through into, something at least a little more objective. He makes such a great point in here when he says, as the title implies, this paper's goal is not to decide what astronomical phenomena the Star of Bethlehem described in the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel might have been. That debate has raged in scholarly circles at least since Kepler, and certainly in the popular imagination since long before him, and will surely continue unabated, with or without my contribution. Rather, what my research has shown, and what I will argue in this paper, is that how one frames this question, what was the Star of Bethlehem, and how one answers it, reveals a great deal more about the person making the inquiry than about the star itself. The question and its answer tell us more about what one sees in the second chapter of Matthew than about what was or was not seen in the night sky of Palestine 2,000 years ago. Now, I think this paper should be a required reading for anybody who's going to venture an opinion on the star, be they an astronomer, an astrologer, a biblical scholar, or otherwise, because we do so much projection in this work. He makes a further point here in talking about, again, this heavenly host of books and papers that have been published. And again, not just by astronomers, but also by astrologers. And I think this point really, really nails it. The plethora of scientific explanations of the star goes a long way towards suggesting that no one of them has a definitive claim, and that the methodology that produces them is essentially flawed. A methodology that produces one or two new explanations for a given question each year must strike anyone as a less than helpful way to approach the question. So again, I'm not asking what was the Star of Bethlehem. In fact, I'm not entirely convinced that there was one per se. The story in the Gospel of Matthew is actually a later addition to the Gospel. The Gospel of Matthew is unique. It was composed from a collection of sayings of Jesus, and I think in many ways it's one of the more authentic ones for the sayings themselves, the oracular utterances, the parables and whatnot. And then there's a narrative put around it. All right. So here's the actual story. And again, this intro, this overture the Story of the Magi, is a later edition. And we really don't know who wrote it, but it's very short. And it says that the Magi came from the East. He does use the word Magi specifically. He doesn't say wise men. He doesn't say astrologers. In the original editions, he uses the word Magi, and that's a very distinct reference to people who lived right next door. It's not some generalized concept. They literally lived to the east, right next door. And he gives very little astronomical information. The Magi come to Jerusalem. They go to Herod's court and they say, "Where is he? Where is he who's born King of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." And King Herod sits them down. They're all disturbed. Jerusalem with him. He calls the people's chief priests, teachers of the law, and asks them where this Messiah was to be born. And then Matthew does something that he does throughout his gospel. He brings a snippet of prophecy from some Old Testament book. Because he's very much writing to the Jews, to Judeans in the first century, after the fall of the temple. Everything about this gospel is directed towards their concerns and their beliefs, and that's important to keep in mind. It's a religious propaganda piece directed at a specific audience. So he's always talking about the law, the Sabbath, what the scribes and the Pharisees are doing, and he keeps making these references to snippets of prophecy from the Old Testament, many of which are taken completely out of context, such as this piece from Micah, or the earlier references he makes to the baby being born of a virgin. It wouldn't pass muster in an undergraduate college class these days, but anyways, that's where we're at with this. So Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." And after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Okay, now this Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. Matthew. He stops right there. He doesn't tell us. That's a really important omission. I think if he really wanted to convey astronomical information, this would have been a good place to do it, but he doesn't. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. And I think when astronomers or astrologers come at this and try to dig a lot of astronomical information out of it, I think they're wasting their time. And that's anachronistic. That's, again, just projecting ourselves upon this document. And I think you'll go astray that way. If he'd really wanted to tell us astronomy, he would have. And again, going back to Pathenroth's article, he kind of says the same thing. This quotation points to the crux of the matter for these interpreters, because according to Matthew, the star which they'd seen in the east went before them till it came to rest over the place where the child was. If this is taken literally as an eyewitness report of what happened at the time of Jesus' birth, then no known astronomical data would fit the description, because no known heavenly body flits about and hovers over a particular place, except, of course, UFOs, a possible explanation that has been entertained by some. So, again, I'm just going to say for the record, I mean, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, but I'm not a fundamentalist in any way, and I can't tell you for sure that this incident ever actually happened, or that there was a specific Star of Bethlehem, and I'm certainly not going to base it upon this text for a lot of good reasons. But I will tell you that this is in the Gospel of Matthew. It opens the Gospel of Matthew for a reason, for very important reasons, because these kind of beliefs were extremely important at the time and to the people that Matthew was writing for, and very helpful in making his case for Jesus Christ. And that's a lot more important to me. So the first question we're going to ask is, who were the Magi? Again, they were very real people. They lived right next door. This is an early depiction of them, circa 600, and it's from Italy. But you do see they've got kind of Persian dress, and they have these very distinctive caps on their heads. This is a little more authentic. On the right is a Magian priest from Anatolia, Turkey. And notice the distinctive headgear. And then we've got these little drawings here of Parthian headgear. Now these are, it's a little bit earlier than Matthew's story, but these are Parthian Magi. These are the guys that came to Jerusalem. And as you can see, they've got that weird kind of hat with the ear flaps thing going on. So who were they? The Magi were the hereditary priesthood of the Persian Zoroastrian religion. And they were originally a tribe of the Medes in northern Iran. And they were the priestly astronomical tribe of the Medes. And to make a long story short, when Cyrus the Great built the Medo-Persian Empire, there was a fusion, and they became the hereditary priests and astrologers of the Persian Zoroastrian religion. Long history in that capacity, were extremely famous and extremely powerful throughout the ancient world because the Persians were, and wherever the Persians went, the Magi went with them with great religious authority and great theopolitical authority. The Persian Zoroastrian religion is not, an everyday topic in the West, but it should be. I agree with Mary Boyce here, who was perhaps the top Zoroastrian scholar of the 20th century, that Zoroastrianism is the oldest of the revealed world religions. It has probably had more influence on mankind directly and indirectly than any other single faith. You won't hear many people say that in the West, but the evidence points in that direction. And I'll show you some of it. Again, it's to get our heads around who the Magi were and why they're in this story. Now, if you or anyone you know has ever believed in any of these items, like God and the devil, heaven and hell, the last judgment, the resurrection of the dead, angels and demons, the Holy Spirit, the Messiah, the virgin birth of the Messiah, and or the ultimate battle between good and evil at the end of the world, then you can thank the Persian prophet Zoroaster and the Magi for that, because that's what they were into. Also, you probably have a lot more in common with Muslims than you realize, because they're into all of that too. It's the exact same religion. Now, some basic tenets of the Persian Zoroastrian religion, they're monotheistic, but is a dualistic monotheism. Well, guess what? So is Christianity, and so is Islam. In other words, there's God and there's the devil. It's very hard to find a biblical justification for the devil because it doesn't come from the Bible. It's Zoroastrian. In Zoroastrianism, there's the good God, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, and he's a creator. He created mankind. He created a good world to live in. And the world is like a separate time-space entity. It's created, and it's within infinity and the vastness where Ahura Mazda lives. But in time-space, where we live, we're ruled over by Ahura Mazda, the good Lord. But even though he reigns supreme in this world, he's constantly opposed and undone by Angramanyu, the evil god, the devil, who counters every good creation by creating something evil to undo it. Thus, our world is a staging ground for an ongoing battle between good and evil. This, my friends, is the origin of the apocalypse. And this is what the Magi and the Zoroastrians were into. And you can see these depictions of the Persian Ahura Mazda. He looks, in this representation, very much like the Assyrian god, Ashur. There's a definite developmental trend there. Now, the apocalypse, this is extremely important to the Persians and the Magi. All of time in human history is building up to this culmination in an ultimate battle between good and evil, when the forces of good will destroy the forces of evil once and for all, perfecting the world of the good and ushering in a new millennium of peace for the righteous. And I'm sure you've all heard that before, but not as a Persian belief. In fact, the Zoroastrian religion is the matrix where these ideas developed, and through Persian influence, especially the influence of the Persian Empire, they were passed on wholesale into Judaism, into Christianity, into Islam, and beyond. So again, in Zoroastrianism, you actually find the matrix for the origins of this dualistic monotheism, the God and the devil, of prophetic revelation. That God sends these messengers who give revelations and books of heaven and hell, one reward for the righteous and another bad punishment for the evil. The last judgment, the resurrection of the dead, the Holy Spirit, the Messiahs. They actually believed that the good God would send world saviors, messiahs, deliverers, to spread the good religion, to bring new revelations to new territories at specific astrological intervals. in history. And as you can see later on, they had no trouble fitting Jesus Christ and Muhammad into that framework. They also believed in the virgin birth of these messiahs. But most importantly, all of this is leading up to the ultimate battle between good and evil at the end of the world. And all of it is completely astrological. In other words, it's a historical development that's played out in astrological timing. And that's what the Magi did. That's the basis for their astrology. So we're not talking about doing birth charts. It's a whole different kind of emphasis. And it was extremely influential throughout the ancient world. For one thing, because the Persian Empire was so vast and mighty and expansive. And everywhere they went, the Magi went with them as well. And the prophet Zoroaster was perhaps the most influential sage of the pre-Socratic era. And he's quoted by Leoxus of Cnidos in the 4th century. He is credited with introducing some of the philosophy to the Greeks, but specifically its cosmic implications, because there was always this level of mystical time speculation that went along with these ideas. Again, all of this, the coming of messiahs, the rising of new religions, the rising of kings and dynasties, and all leading up to the ultimate battle at the end, it's all timed out astrologically. It's a very complete system. And specifically to sum it up, pulling some of the later threads together, the Persian Magi had these very elaborate systems of mystical time speculation regarding major turning points in this ongoing battle between good and evil, including the millennium, the idea that human history was divided into discrete 1,000-year periods. That's a Persian concept. And for the Persian Magi, these were always astrological millennia. And also, they were really into the cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. And they used them to time their major concerns. And their major concerns were the rise of new dynasties and empires, the coming of new prophets and new religions, the beginning and end of new millennia, and the end of the world. Again, they weren't doing necessarily birth charts. There wasn't necessarily an emphasis, let's say, on individual horoscopes. It was big picture stuff. Now, this particular diagram is an ideal depiction of the cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. And the Persians were really into these. And as we know, the conjunctions occur every 20 years, very regularly. And whenever one conjunction occurs, the next one 20 years later is going to be roughly 120 degrees angle behind the previous one. So for the most part, they're going to be in signs of the same element for a period of time, roughly 200 and something years. And they move through the zodiac. And it's this cycle that's especially important in this mystical time speculation. So the conjunctions are going to be in a particular element, fire, earth, air, water, for roughly 200 something years, but then there's going to be shifts. And that period when it shifts backwards, from fire to water, and then from water to air, those are very significant, those shifts, and that there's going to be big historical changes that accompany those shifts. Now, bear in mind, when you read Mashallah, who's a little bit late, 8th, 9th century AD, he believes that the complete cycle of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions takes 1,000 years for it to go all the way around the zodiac like this. That's a little idealistic. It's about 800 and something, it all depends, but that was how they defined the millennia in that period, was a complete cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. That's who the Magi were. They weren't just some generic idea. They were very real people who were very real to the 1st century Judeans. Next question, why did the authors and editors of the Gospel of Matthew think that Persian Magi practicing astrology would help to make the case for Jesus Christ among 1st century Judeans? You know, I think that's a really relevant question. Again, they put this at the very beginning of this gospel, and they're trying to win people to their cause. How is this going to help? Well, the Magi, again, were very real people who live next door. Now, you know, I know when you use the word Magi to people like us, it doesn't necessarily mean that much. It doesn't really bring up any specific associations. But try to imagine if you were back in first century Judea and you were having a conversation with a person of that time and place and said, oh, he's one of those, you know, right-wing conservative Republicans. I just don't get it. That has a lot of meaning for you, political, religious, social, but it would mean nothing to him. Well, I think it's the same thing when we use the term Magi with contemporary people. It doesn't really mean that much, but for first century Judeans, there was all kinds of personal, social, political, and religious and astrological meanings bound up in that term. Now, they lived right next door. They had a very similar religious and political beliefs, and more specifically, a long history of influence over Judean political and religious traditions, especially when it came to resisting Greek and Roman invaders and using religious astrology to try to overthrow them. Remember earlier on, I showed that, you know, we are the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, but we also think that our cultural heroes are the Greeks and Romans. That's kind of schizophrenic because, in fact, those two cultures were very much at odds. And the real allies of the Judeans were the Zoroastrian Persians, and they fought together repeatedly over the centuries against the incursions of the Greeks and the Romans. And this is an important thing to really try to get our heads around, because not understanding that, I think, causes us to distort history in a lot of unnecessary ways. So let's take a look at who these Persians are next door. They're known as the Parthian dynasty, or the Arsacid dynasty, an empire. This would be what we call the second Persian Empire. The first one was the Achaemenids. We made a reference to them earlier in that quote from Norman Cohn. And they were destroyed by the coming of Alexander in 323 BC. And that's when, you know, the Hellenistic invaders came in and took over Judea, because Judea had been a very important part of the Achaemenid Empire. They're the ones that saved the Judeans from the Babylonian exile and repatriated them and resettled them and helped them, you know, rebuild in Jerusalem. It was an extremely important relationship. That's the whole basis of Second Temple Judaism. But that all got destroyed with the coming of Alexander. But it didn't take long for the Persians to regroup. And by 245 BC, they had regrouped into the Arsacid Empire. And we'll talk about them throughout. So this is what we're talking about in Matthew's time. The second dynasty arose in 245 BCE, expanded into an empire during the period of 165 to 141 BC, when a particular king, Mithridates I, reconquered Media, the original home of the Medes, the Magi, Babylon, Cilicia, and brought them back under Persian control. Now, this was huge. This was like the important territory. So the Persians were back under Mithridates. And of course, in taking that territory, he's pushing back on the Hellenistic. We'll use that term. I'm not entirely sure what it means, but he was pushing back on the Hellenistic rulers. Now, the Parthian successes in the east tied the hands of the the Hellenistic Seleucid rulers sufficiently to make the establishment of the Judean Hasmonean dynasty possible, and vice versa. Again, this is extremely important. They're coordinating their efforts in repelling these foreign invaders, and they're actually helping each other, and it's working. That's the dynasty next door. There's a lot of coordinated political and religious action between them. Let's take a look here quickly at the revolt of the Maccabees. As we said, because Mithridates was making so much headway in taking back territory around that, you know, what they call Babylon, we call it Baghdad nowadays, that distracted the Hellenistic forces and made the revolt of the Maccabees possible, which is still commemorated to this day in the Feast of Hanukkah, when they took back the temple. But this was the beginnings of what they called the Hasmonean dynasty, and by 141 they had established a Judean king in Jerusalem, and that was huge for them. Ironically, he wasn't a king of David's line. He wasn't descended from Judah. They were priests, they were Levites, you know. But nevertheless, they had a Jewish king on the throne, and that was huge. That meant that, you know, good was on the rise and evil was being repelled. And at the same time, Mithridates was making tremendous strides in rebuilding the empire next door. So that was, in their worldview, that was good for the power of good, and, you know, they were winning in the battle against evil, so to speak. Now, when you come up to Matthew's time, you want to bear in mind that you had this Hasmonean dynasty, you had a Jewish king on the throne, but then the Romans by this time had come in. And now the Romans were the problem, so to speak, in Judea. And they're a big problem. And in fact, the Romans had come in and driven the Hasmonean Judean kings off the throne. And they'd installed their man, Herod, who was not even Jewish. They made him king of the Jews, but he was actually Idumean. So that was an affront. That really was offensive. And they'd driven the Hasmoneans out and established Roman rule. So that was bad. Now that was in the 40s BC. Well, there was a very deliberate alliance between the Parthian and the Judean forces. And in 40 BC, they drove Herod out. And they put the last Hasmonean king on the throne in Jerusalem. Now, it only took about 3 years. Herod went to Rome. He gathered up reinforcements, and he came back to Jerusalem, and they fought for a couple of years. But Herod was able to take the throne back. And he took the last Hasmonean king, Antigonus, and he crucified him publicly, hung him high as, you know, here's your king of the Jews. And that was in 37 BC. Not very long, 20 years before, 30 years before the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction that we think might have brought the Magi. So this is very recent history. This is very much on the people's minds at the time. So when Matthew's Magi show up in Herod's court, asking, where is he who's born king of the Jews? You know, that gives it a very different meaning than what we normally bring to that. And in fact, I have to say, I think there's a very good possibility that never happened. If you think about it, it'd be quite a dangerous thing to do. And these were wise men, presumably, not suicidal idiots. You know, and the story goes on, as we all know, that, you know, when the Magi didn't come back and tell them where the baby was, at Herod and did the slaughter of the innocents and killed all the children under 2 years of age. Hence the flight into Egypt from Mary and Joseph. But I have to say, I think if the Magi had actually showed up as representatives of the Parthian royalty and nobility in Jerusalem, and showed up at Herod's court and asked, where is he who's born king of the Jews? I think the story would have stopped right there. We wouldn't be talking about the slaughter of innocents. We'd be talking about the slaughter of the Magi. You know, I just think that's a little far-fetched. So in this first century, in this period, you know, there's a lot of literature that shows that the Jews were looking to the Parthians for deliverance. And Rabbi Nussner, Jacob Nussner, was one of the best authors in this line, and his material is great. I strongly recommend it. He passed away a couple of years ago, but I was really fortunate to get to know him up at Bard College in Rhinebeck. And he's got some really beautiful work in this direction. Here's a quote from Mishnah: put my coffin deep down in the earth. There's not one palm tree in Babylon to which a Persian horse will not be tethered, nor one coffin in Palestine out of which a Median horse, Magi, will not eat straw. And here's an example of the Persian cavalry and their famous Parthian shot. They were trained at full gallop to be able to turn completely around in the saddle and fire off arrows behind them, and notice there's no stirrups. These guys were deadly. They literally took 2 Roman Caesars captive in battle. And if you ever wondered why the Roman Empire never really expanded far beyond Judea, you're looking at the reason why. The Parthians. These guys were bad. They were tough. Here's another quote from some rabbinical literature where he says, if you see a Persian horse tethered to a grave in the land of Israel, look out for the coming of the Messiah. You know, they really equated this idea of Persian deliverance with the coming of the Messiah. In fact, I think you can go right into the Second Temple literature, and there's some great stuff that, you know, really this messianic idea that, you know, this Messiah is going to come forth from Judea, it really takes root in the Second Temple period when the Persians reconstituted them. And that, when you understand the larger context, that starts to make a whole lot of sense. And again, this goes back to this pivotal period when Cyrus the Great, the original Persian emperor, took Babylon in the fall of 538 BC. He not only repatriated the Jews to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was in ruins. I mean, it had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and that's the Babylonian captivity. The Jews were in captivity in Babylon. He repatriated them. He funded their return. He provided the resources and the protection necessary to rebuild the city, began the restoration of the temple. That's all in the Bible. It's very clear. In fact, the only person that the Bible refers to as a Messiah is Cyrus. Okay, that's how important this guy was. And, you know, why did he do it? Well, he had very good reasons for doing it. This is how they built empire. They were really innovative and humanitarian in how they went about doing things. So I think, you know, in looking at who the Magi were, why they were important to first century Judeans, important enough to end up in the opening of the gospel, we want to look at a larger picture of what I call inclusive monotheism rather than exclusive monotheism. There's a transmission of a body of core beliefs from the matrix in Persian Zoroastrianism through the 3 great monotheistic Abrahamic religions onto the modern Baha'i faith. And when you start to look at it that way, then the Star of the Magi makes perfect sense. You wouldn't write the Gospel of Matthew without it. But again, this is what they call inclusive monotheism. Unfortunately, exclusive monotheism predominates throughout the Western Judeo-Christian tradition. Islam is actually considerably more inclusive, but they're later, so like they kind of have to be. But you know, Christians in particular are like, oh yeah, it's from God's lips to the prophet's ear to our Bible, and they don't even want to know about the historical context or social context or developmental context, because you know, that's not necessarily convenient. But just bear in mind, that's not the only point of view. There is the idea of inclusive monotheism and this transmission of a shared body of core beliefs, again, in which the Star of the Magi makes perfect sense. Now, the next question, how did the Magi's astrology inform their beliefs? Well, this leads us on kind of a detective story through astrological history, because one of the things that we know about the Magi is a hereditary priestly order. Like the Druids, they didn't really like to write things down. They liked to memorize things and memorize history and train for a long time. And it was hereditary. It wasn't really open to outsiders. So, you know, I'd love to say we have all these texts, you know, but we don't. Further, there were texts. They did write some things down, but they were very deliberate attempts to destroy the text. There's a wonderful story of when Alexander took the Persian capital of how they, Persepolis, you know, the big party they had when they burned the entire library and burned everything down to the ground. So, you know, he destroyed all the text, or at least so we're told. Then when the Muslims came as well, there was a great destruction of text. So for people who didn't really like to write things down in the first place and guarded their knowledge very closely, and then to go through all of that disruption, it's a wonder, you know, that we have anything at all. But in fact, there's a lot of evidence. Now, our earliest textual source for the Persian use of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, specifically for political, historic, and religious astrology in predicting and analyzing the rise and fall of kingdoms, dynasties and empires, the coming of great prophets and their religions, and ultimately the final battle between good and evil at the end of the world, is Mashallah. And Mashallah, I'm a big Mashallah fan, I'll say it up front. You know, I think he's one of the greatest astrologers who ever lived. Here he is as depicted by Albrecht Dürer. I think we can pretty much guarantee that he looked absolutely nothing like that. But he did live in the 8th century CE AD in what we would now call Baghdad. He was a Jew near Basra. And he was a brilliant astrologer. He was one of a select group of astrologers, along with a Persian on the Ba'at, who was chosen by the Caliph at the time to elect the chart for the foundation of the city of Baghdad. And that's quite a foundation chart. It worked out quite well. And he composed a book entitled On Conjunctions, Religions, and Peoples, in which he presented a series of horoscopes relevant to the birth of Jesus Christ and Christianity, and also the birth of the Prophet Muhammad and Islam, all of which fit into that coming world saviors, born of virgins matrix. Now, I want to point out that, as I said, he's our earliest textual source. There was a great revival of Persian astrology and of interest in Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions earlier, during the reign of Khosrow. He was maybe one of the greatest Persian Sasanian emperors, and this was shortly before the coming of the Muslims. And they made a point of gathering in all the texts from around the kingdom, and they always went for the astrology text first. That's one of the things you learn from history. Whenever you have a revival of learning, the first thing you want is the astrology text. Then they get their bearings with that. So Kai Khosrow led that, and some of those translations are ongoing. So we're probably in the process of finding earlier sources. And I didn't want to leave that unsaid. But again, Mashallah is a little bit late, but he's important. Okay, now where he fits into this time scale in 762 AD or CE. This is only about 100 years after the death of Muhammad. And the new Islamic dynasty, expanded very quickly. It took a tremendous amount of territory very quickly. But then they had their own problems. That was the Umayyad dynasty, and opposition arose. And they called themselves the Abbasids, and they led a revolt, they led a rebellion, and they took over the Muslim Empire. And the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur moved the Muslim Empire's capital out of Damascus, where it had been under the Umayyads, and back into the Persian territory, where he founded his new Medina al-Salam, his shining new city of peace on the Tigris, which we now call Baghdad. And it was the wonder of the world in those days. Now, its proximity to the nearby ruins of ancient Babylon, Ctesiphon, and Seleucia, they were the old crumbling capitals of the former Parthian, Sasanian, and Seleucid empires. That's where he moved the capital there. And they lent his new city the credibility that the caliphs craved. And the Abbasids had other good reasons for burrowing deep into the heart of Persia. It gave them tremendous credibility, and they needed that as an upstart, revolutionary new empire. Now, as Richard Hooker explains it, and he's one of my favorite historians in anything Persian, the overwhelming majority of foreigners who rallied to the Abbasid cause were Iranian. And when the Abbasids, this is being blocked on my screen, so I'm having trouble reading, but when they moved their capital out of the Semitic world, originally from Arabia and into Damascus and Syria, when they moved out of the Semitic world back into the Persian world in Iraq, this was taking on tremendous empirical cachet. It gave them a whole new status. And as Hooker points out, the Abbasids turned to the past to legitimate their power and unite the various factions under their rule, assuming the glories of the former Persian Empire as their own. Initially, the new leadership undertook a program of deliberate re-Persianization, in which both astrology and Persian ideology played a central role in establishing the cultural identity of this new Islamic empire. Now, interestingly enough, the date has come down to us through time of the inception of the Abbasid revolt. And I think it's interesting this date is preserved so well, because it's an important date. And in our calendar, it comes out to November 28th, 749. And they were in Kufa, which would again be near Babylon, Baghdad. And they declared the uprising, the insurgency, and it turned out to be very successful. And if you notice, the date chosen is actually, when you do the sunrise chart, it's the heliacal rising of a very tight Jupiter-Saturn conjunction within 1 degree. And this began not only their revolt, but a period of deliberate re-Persianization of the Muslim empire. This is how Persians thought. This is how they operated. And this is how they saw the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions operating throughout their history. The result of all of this was a golden age, an Islamic renaissance in science and mathematics, to which the West remains perpetually indebted. It was the Dark Ages in Europe. And when we talk about, the Renaissance that was spurred by the importation of Islamic and Arabic texts, this is where it started. This is where it came from. So, you have to remember that cultures go in cycles. And even though we're very proud of our accomplishments in the West, we haven't been on top of the heap always. There were times when we were very indebted to Muslim scholars, and they made tremendous more progress in math and science than we were making at the time. Case in point. So the Abbasid result was extremely successful, and in the West we still call this the new Arabic learning, as our medieval forebears called it as well. But that's a gross oversimplification. It unwittingly obscures the real influences in this process. Arabic was more of a linguistic distinction than a cultural one. And I've got a lot of sources here. This is one of my favorites. It's Greek thought, Arabic culture. I highly recommend it, and it's in the bibliographies. But he talks about how, it's like the term Hellenistic. I think it obscures more than it describes. And when we say, the Arabic texts that were coming out of the Muslim Empire, they were in the Arabic language. But in fact, the scholars and translators who worked on them, there were very few Arabs among them. Al-Kindi's really the only major one. The rest of them were Persians. They came from the former Sasanian territories. And they saw themselves as restoring and carrying on the revered traditions of their Persian ancestors, which included a tremendous reverence for scholarship, for math and science and astronomy. That's how they saw themselves. Yes, they were translating this work into Arabic, but the work itself, I don't think that it's fair to really give it that name. Now, what was Mashallah doing in this book? And I actually have Mashallah's book here as well. Again, it's one of my favorites. This is called The Astrological History of Mashallah. It's Kennedy and Pengrave. When it comes to the history of astronomy, you can't go wrong with these two guys. They're my mainstays. And they have the book on conjunctions, people and religions translated in here. It's got lots of notes and additional information. Again, I can't recommend it enough. Now, in this book, what Mashallah uses is the shift of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions from the water to the fire signs as the most important indicator of the birth of Christ. Remember, the conjunctions stay in a particular element for roughly 200 and something years, and then they shift, and those shifts are important in the system. Further, they're not doing birth charts, remember? And what they like to do, the Persians, is they would set the chart for the Brahma, which to this date, they still celebrate as the beginning of the year. It's a big celebration, Nowruz, throughout Persia. And it was very important in Persian astrology. And they would set the chart for when the sun was at that, 0 degrees at the very beginning of the year at the vernal equinox, and then they would read that chart for the year. And I think we could make the case that, when you see people reading charts for solstices to see what's going to happen that season, I think we can make the case that that's probably where that started, although it was really just for the vernal equinox. Okay, so mashallah was big into that, and of course, if you did the chart for the vernal equinox and you had a big old Saturn-Jupiter conjunction going on, it'd probably be a big year. Okay, so this is what he does throughout the book. He casts the exact date and time of the vernal equinox, or the year transfer chart, as he calls it, preceding the Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions, and particularly the shifts. So he uses 3 astrological charts that he says are the most indicative of the coming of Christ. The first one is the vernal equinox preceding the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Sagittarius in 45 BCE, marking the shift from the water signs into the fire signs. Now, that 45 BC period, that's when Herod is being installed as the king of Judea and driving the Hasmonean king off the throne, and then the Parthians come in, Herod out, back, okay, that Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. And he calls that the shift into the fire signs. Now, bear in mind, when that shift occurs all depends on which zodiac you're using. And in this period, are they using the tropical? Maybe not. The Persians use the word Zij, like Indians would use Ayanosha. So which Zij are they using? I mean, it depends. But he claims that that's when it shifted. If you put in a tropical zodiac, it kind of looks like the Saturn shifted into Sagittarius, but the Jupiter might still be in Scorpio. Okay, but that's what he used it for. Now, then he used it for again, he used 3 charts here. Okay? None of them are birth charts. They're all year transfer charts. The vernal equinox preceding the first Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Leo in 25 BCE. He thought that was extremely important, that first conjunction in Leo. Then he used a 3rd chart for the vernal equinox of 12 BC, which he claims was the year of Christ's birth. Now, take that with a grain of salt, because his math is very contradictory, and this all does come down to us through the hand of one of his later transcribers. And as Kennedy and Pengree point out in this book, and again, these guys are the best. If we check Mashallah's map relative to the birth of Muhammad, and we'll look at some of his charts for that in a minute, we get a date of 1 BC for the birth of Jesus, which is more like it. Who thinks Jesus was born in 12 BC? So while Mashallah may have known of the more traditional date, he apparently set great store by that conjunction in the royal sign of Leo, and had his reasons for linking the birth of Christ to it. Now, his compatriot and one of the guys that he worked with in Baghdad, especially in electing the inception chart for Baghdad, was Umar Tiberiadis. And from his work, writing of the first Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Leo, after the shift into the fire sign, he says, this point of time indicates the sum of what happens in this period. At this point of time, there's a shift from one condition to another, a change in genera and shapes, and new matters the like of which has never occurred before. No indication is like its indication. No period is like its period. And there's no doubt about the change. Wow, that sounds really important. Well, okay, so now the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions have shifted into the fire signs, and he's talking about the first one that occurs in Leo. And by the way, this is from Yamamoto and Burnett's Abu Mashar on Historical Astrology. Again, a 2-volume set I cannot recommend enough. And I was blessed, it's very expensive. Roz Park gifted it to me. Thank you, Roz, forever. But if you can get your hands on this, that's everything you ever wanted to know from Abu Mashar, who, as we know, was a notorious liar, but an important liar. Okay, so this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Leo seems to have been extremely important, and I've got a chart for it here. It's a little contrived because, at this point we've got Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, and Leo over here, and the sun's trining it. It looks really great. We're going to come back to this chart shortly, okay? Now, I want to point out that because the Persians are looking for these messengers, these prophets that are going to come at the appropriate astrological intervals with new revelations to spread the good religion to new territory throughout the earth. They're really into the coming of Muhammad in the same way as they sought Jesus Christ. And mashallah uses the same methods for the birth of the prophet Muhammad. He uses a chart for the vernal equinox preceding the shift of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions from the air to the water signs in 571 CE. That's introduced for the birth of Muhammad. Again, not a birth chart, but a year transfer chart. Then he uses a second chart set for the vernal equinox preceding the next conjunction in Scorpio, 630 CE, for the Hijra, which is actually the founding of the religion. Now, Muhammad was born sometime near 571 CE. But it's hard to say precisely when, because the later Islamic astrologers kept moving his birthday around to make it match more closely with the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in 571 CE. This is the date that you'll find for Muhammad's birthday. If you go to Wikipedia or go to any Islamic site, they'll tell you this is his birthday. It's certainly contrived. He was not born on this date, but this is the one they use, and you can see where they use it. The sun is opposite the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. That's how important this stuff was to these people. And in fact, the earliest reference that we have to Muhammad's actual birth date comes from Mashallah. This is why I love this guy. And he says that Muhammad was born February 7th. He was actually an Aquarius. So we'll leave that one up in the air. The one thing that we can take away from this is we don't know when he was born, but the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were really important to these people in this territory throughout these times. Now, although Mashallah was a Jew with Zoroastrian sympathies, he was writing about the birth of Christ under an Islamic regime. And by combining the conjunctions and showing all the connections between all the religions, he was presenting Christ and Muhammad as the first two world saviors, or sons of Zoroaster. And Pingree and Kennedy agree that with a little adjustment in his numbers, one finds perfect correspondence between the Zoroastrian doctrine and Mashallah. The motion of the heavens commences in the 4th millennium. The deluge, the flood, occurs at the 6th millennium. And Christ and Muhammad, who defeat evil, were both born in the 10th millennium. That's what these guys were into. But again, this stuff is late. Okay, we don't really have the texts that it's based upon, but we wouldn't be safe in assuming that they just made this up in the time of Mashallah. Not at all. But what about Matthew's Magi? Okay, does this mean that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 6-7 BCE was the Star of Bethlehem? That is the one candidate where you get some agreement amongst astronomers and historians. Not for these reasons. They have other reasons. But I think that's an important point, because everybody else, the astronomers and the astrologers that are, no, this is my Star of Bethlehem. No, this is my Star of Bethlehem. There's no consensus there. But there is some scholarly consensus that, probably that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction had something to do with it. Can we say for sure? No, we can't. First, I've got some doubt as to whether the whole story ever happened in the first place. I think it's hard to prove it conclusively either way. But was it important to them? Did it fit in to their worldview? Did it fit into their astrological point of view? Absolutely. Absolutely. And we don't necessarily have to take Mashallah's word for it. Again, we know that there was a great revival of Persian astrology before Mashallah, and of their interest in the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. That was before the coming of Islam under Kai Khusro. So these traditions definitely predate Mashallah, but demonstrating that historically, it is difficult. You need evidence. So we're going to look at a slightly different kind of evidence now, and I'm going to take you back 500 years to the dawn of the Persian Empire. And Cyrus, who took all the territory, died suddenly in battle, and there was a crisis of succession. And his son, for a number of reasons, didn't make it and probably got off. And the succession ended up going to a more distant relative, Darius, who, as it turned out, was, you know, more than up to the job, and he served much like Octavian did to Julius Caesar in really successfully administrating all the territory that Cyrus had conquered and welding it into an actual empire that lasted. But he had to fight for it, and in fact, shortly after the death of Cyrus' son, who was probably off because nobody liked him anyways, there was a revolt by the Magi, as it comes down to it. And there was a battle, and Darius had to come in and vanquish them. And in fact, this carving that we're looking at here actually depicts Darius vanquishing all of his enemies and killing off the leaders of the Magi and cementing the succession and his role as the new emperor of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This is at a place called Behistun, and it's contemporary with Darius. And it's carved into the side of the mountain. It's quite large. And it's actually over the main trade route, so that anybody coming and going is going to have to go past this and see it. And the inscriptions, you know, tell the whole story of how these evil Magians, you know, tried to take the rulership away from the rightful king who was chosen by Ahura Mazda, which would be Darius, our guy. So there's a lot of propaganda in this, and it's kind of hard to tell exactly what happened. But I want to point out first that when Cyrus took Babylon and brought the Medo-Persian Empire to Babylon, and that was the most important city of the day, it brought the Magi into supervisory capacity over the Chaldean astrologers of Babylon. And you had this incredible merging of Magian astrology and their worldview, and of course the Chaldean and Babylonian astrology, which was, you know, pretty cracking, probably the best in the world. And they had, you know, they had the records of observations going back so long, and that was an incredible resource. And what essentially happened, right after Cyrus took Babylon, which around 525 BC to about 515 BC, is this tremendous flowering of mathematical astronomy. For the first time, they had the right people and the right records, and they got the work done very quickly, and they figured out the orbits of the planets. They figured out that they were orbiting, that it was cyclical, and that you could predict it. You could track it mathematically and predict it. And this was a huge development in the history of science, in the history of math, in the history of astronomy. And again, it came about very quickly, right after Cyrus took Babylon, because of that introduction of the Magian minds melding with the Chaldean minds. So it was incredibly prolific. So it's at this very point where you have the succession and the revolt of the Magi, and Darius vanquishes them, and they carve this thing at Behistun. And what's really interesting, as Gerard Winford pointed out many years ago, is that there are dates in these inscriptions exactly when the events of the revolt and Darius's suppression of the revolt took place. And I was really thrilled to get those dates maybe 10 years ago. I actually met Winford in New York at a Zoroastrian congress. It's quite a character, and I'm eternally grateful. I think everyone's eternally grateful to him for pointing this out. And he was the kind of guy that could actually read this stuff. So he got the dates, and when I sat down and did the charts, I was really amazed. This is a recent paper that someone's done on Behistun, and I just pulled up the abstract. It's just last August. It's very recent. And he's saying, you know, I have a new hypothesis. The Behistun inscription is an imperial calendar. He's talking about the dates on this, because this is really important. And he's actually proposing that the function for the dates in this Behistun inscription is, along with telling the authorized story of righteous succession and how Darius vanquished the evil, the evil Magi who were rebelling against divine order. So it's this righteous ascension that made the empire possible, and maybe even established a calendar of historic commemoration. The article makes observations about the internal chronography, its synchronization of the Persian and Babylonian calendars, the function of its single year container for the battles, the day and month stability. This is important. They're melding all the time systems into one in this inscription. And this was the genius of Darius. He did this with law and culture everywhere he went. He was a more than capable successor to Cyrus. However, when you actually do the charts for the dates, right at this point where they just figured out mathematical astronomy, what you notice is that the revolt took place at a very important Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, a triple conjunction, that started on December 17th. And I'm using the Fagan-Bradley, Ziege, or Ayadam Shah. I don't know what they were using at the time, but this is what I'm using. Here's the date for the initial revolt from Behest. Okay. This is the first conjunction here. Here's the initial revolt here. And as you can see, it's March 11th. The sun is almost at the year transfer point, and it's coming to opposition. And there is an exact Jupiter-Sun conjunction going on when they have the revolt. Now, the second date is when Smerdis, the evil Magi, the leader, was officially proclaimed king. And of course, that's just wrong. That is against Ahura Mazda's will, right? So here you've got the sun at 11 Cancer, and it's separating from the square to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. Now, not 3 months later, Darius comes in, and the Magi are in this big mountain stronghold, and he storms the stronghold and wins the day and kills Smerdis, vanquishes the evil Magians, and order is returned to the empire. And as you can see, this date is very carefully preserved there, September 29th, when the sun is now conjunct the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. That's what's enshrined in these dates, and that is the basis for what later scholars are recognizing without the astrology as this immensely important timekeeping revelation, where they've consolidated the ancient calendars together. And again, this is exactly how Darius operated. He was an administrative genius, and he did this all over the ancient world. This guy invented the Pony Express. I mean, he was the man. But you can see that at the dawn of mathematical astronomy, they were watching and they saw this. And I think when we talk about the Persian use of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, we have to bear this in mind. This is what they saw. And as you move forward through their history, for instance, two major turning points, coming of Alexander, this was huge. He destroyed Cyrus and Darius' empire. So this was evil coming, and good was being vanquished. So now Alexander took all this territory, and then he decided, I've had enough of conquering. I'm going to go to Babylon and establish my court and consolidate my empire. And so he returns to Babylon. This is the chart, May 16th, 324 BC. And as you can see, it's an exact Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. And I assure you that this was elected. This was his triumphal return to Babylon, the establishment of his court and the seat of his newly conquered empire. Of course, he had astrologers electing this for him. Unfortunately, he died a year later after eating a meal. So I think chances are he was poisoned. I'm thinking there were probably people in Babylon that kind of had something against him. Okay. However, this is the date for the death of Alexander in Babylon. It is the exact new moon at 21 degrees, the exact same degree as the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that he returned. Well, that's what happens when evil tries to take over the righteous rulership, at least according to the Magian ways of thinking. Again, they're watching. They're watching. This knowledge builds out over time. So you've got the Seleucid Empire that comes in, but it doesn't take too long for the Persians to get it back together. And this is the beginning of the Arsacid dynasty, when they started rebelling against the Seleucid rulers and getting it together. And that was 245 BC, and here's the year transfer chart, and we've got Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that, wow, this is magical, astrology really works. I think they would elect this, actually, and they would operate according to these these rules. And bearing in mind, you've got a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction every 20 years. So there's some level of coincidence in here, I'm sure. But again, even though we don't have the text, we can look back at some of the history, understanding that, of course, these rulers are operating with Magian advisors, and they're timing what they're doing, and they're electing a lot of this. Okay, now, I'm going the wrong way. Remember, the Arsacid dynasty really started to grow in 160 to 40, and that allowed the Maccabee revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty to take hold in Judea and Jerusalem. This is the year of great success for the Maccabees. They've been fighting the Greeks for a while, but they really got it together in 165. Judah Maccabee had passed away. I want to get this right, Matthias, maybe it was the father. This was the son. And this was the year that they really, they won all the major battles and they consolidated their control and took Jerusalem. And again, there's Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that year. And they're watching. The time, Mithridates, it took like 20 years to really take this territory back, but especially during the years 147 to 141, that's when he got into, Babylon and took, the real heartland of the ancient empire. So this was hugely important. And again, made possible by what was going on in Judea and vice versa. Both sides were helping each other fight the same enemy. Again, these dates have come down to us. They were carefully preserved. Specifically, Mithridates' triumphal entrance into his new royal capital and the proclamation of this new empire. So he'd taken this heartland territory back. And again, they timed and elected big triumphal entrance and an official establishment of the royal capital. Now, if we go back to the previous Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, was triple conjunction in Cancer. Here it is, 17 Cancer, and again, I'm using the fake and Ravi zodiac. I don't know what they were using. Then it repeated at 21, and that was in 45 BC. So when he stages his triumphal entry for all this territory that he took, he does it at the new moon in Cancer on the same degree as the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which is very similar to what we saw with Alexander, except that, of course, in the Magian perspective, Alexander was evil. That was, evil being defeated, and here is Mithridates coming in, that is the good rule returning to the earth. Again, I'm not saying that, look, astrology works. I'm saying they're electing this, and I think we can probably assume that they're watching and they're trying deliberately to operate that way. So now let's move up to that first conjunction in Leo that Mashallah and Omar were so excited about in 27 BC. Mashallah said, you will know that the greatest and most miraculous things happen from the conjunction of superior planets, and this happens because of the slowness of their motion. And when three planets are joined in one term or phase, and the sun aspects them, they will signify destruction of sects and kingdoms, and their alteration and greatest events according to the degree of their fortitude and the prevailing over their signs. And this is the greatest conjunction. And it signifies prophecy and destruction of certain climates and greatest things, and especially if some inferior planet be helping to them. Well, again, here's that chart that I showed you before, where not only do we have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Leo, but it's joined by Mars, it's trine by the Sun, and again, this is the same one that, Omar was writing about as well, that there's nothing like this. There's no indication like its indication, no period like its period, no doubt about the change. So what was going on in 27 BC? Yeah, that was the beginning of the reign of Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. And this is extremely important to the whole story here. And at this point, I want to, see if anybody's got any questions or comments on that. And I also want to turn it over to Demetra, because she's got some material on how the Romans saw this and what constituted a notable nativity. Because obviously, Mashallah and Omar saw Christ as very important as the bringer of a new revelation, the son of Zoroaster. But they're also recognizing the importance of Augustus and the Roman Empire. And that's the year, 27.